Hi there, here's a video explanation of the abolition movement. We'll start with a few key terms to understand this topic. Abolition is the act of officially stopping or ending something, and so in this case we are talking about the abolition or the ending of slavery. The abolition movement is the organized effort to end the practice of slavery in the United States, which was legal in the country until 1865 when it was abolished by the 13th Amendment. An abolitionist, then, is a person who sought to abolish slavery in the 19th century, hoping for the total emancipation or freedom of all slaves. And the Underground Railroad was a network of people and homes offering shelter to fugitive slaves. So the individuals we're going to look at here in this video are specific abolitionists, so people who are trying to end slavery. In the Underground Railroad, it's important to understand, of course, that this is not a literal railroad underground. It's not a subway. It is a title, a name for the network of homes and different locations where fugitives or runaway slaves could find safety. We'll start with Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was born in Connecticut. She lived from 1811 to 1896, and her greatest contribution to the abolition movement was publishing a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, which follows the story of a group of slaves, most notably one named Tom, and their treatment throughout the South as they are bought and sold, sent to different plantations with different owners. And it was very eye-opening to many Northerners who did not fully understand what slavery was like. And so this gave a very real visual for Northerners to see what this institution of slavery actually looked like in the South. It was so popular that over 300,000 copies were sold in the first 3 months alone, which was obviously primarily sold in the North and gained a lot of traction for the abolition movement. At one point, Harriet Beecher Stowe met President Abraham Lincoln, who referred to her as the little woman who had started the whole war, referring to the Civil War. She also housed fugitive slaves in her house as a part of the Underground Railroad. But her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the bestseller throughout the United States in the 1800s, was hugely influential in kickstarting the abolition movement in the North. Next is Harriet Tubman. She was born in Maryland, roughly in the year 1820. We don't know exactly when she was born. She lived until 1913. She was born as a slave and escaped slavery in 1849, but she returned to the South over and over to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So she risked her life dozens of times to come back into slaveholding territory to lead others on the road to freedom along the Underground Railroad. She personally led at least 70 slaves to freedom, but she also passed along information to help many others escape. So again, risking her own life as a former slave, coming back into the South to help others escape along the Underground Railroad. She is perhaps the most famous participant in the Underground Railroad. Next is Henry Highland Garnet. He's not as famous as some of these other abolitionists, but he represents a different form of the abolition movement. So he was born as a slave in Maryland, lived from 1815 to 1882. He also escaped from slavery and with his family moved to the North. He eventually became a very famous minister in a church in New York, where he was very outspoken about his belief that slavery should end. He believed very strongly, though, in a militant or radical form of abolition, which meant that he supported a violent revolt against slavery. He believed that slaves should resort to violence if necessary to take up arms in order to fight for their freedom. He also believed in a radical view of moving African Americans from the United States out of the country, that they should move to Mexico or to Liberia, which was a newly formed nation in West Africa, where they could live in freedom, but that their best option in his mind was that they should entirely leave the United States and go elsewhere. And so Henry Highland Garnet represents this much more radical or militant form of abolition. Finally, one of the most famous abolitionists of all, Frederick Douglass, again born in Maryland, lived from 1818 to 1895. He was born into slavery as well, but he was taught secretly to read by the wives of one of his slave owners. So he used that knowledge, that ability to read and write, to gain an education and ultimately become a very prolific speaker and writer about the institution of slavery. So he wrote this book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It was an autobiography, and it became a bestseller. He was a leader throughout the North who traveled from city to city giving speeches about slavery and why it should be abolished. And his experience as a former slave and his ability to speak very clearly, to articulate his experiences as a former slave were very eye-opening and influential to Northerners in convincing them through these passionate speeches and through his writings that slavery should be abolished. So these four famous abolitionists, certainly not the only abolitionists, but four of the most influential in speaking about the injustices of slavery and fighting for its abolition. Thanks for watching. Hope this helps.